President Trump and I agree about this. Too many people have been left behind, even as our economies surged. So I was heartened to hear the President talk about the importance of skills training in his State of the Union address. We in Canada are seized with the same problem and have reached a similar conclusion. The wave of technological innovation that's being led by bright minds in this state, in many cases, can be hugely positive and transformative for North Americans, but we cannot allow it to become a wave that sweeps working people and their families aside. This is something we can and must address as we modernize and improve NAFTA. And again, I'll repeat that in French for the folks back home. J'étais heureux d'entendre le président parler de l'importance de la formation des compétences lors de son discours sur l'état de l'Union. Au Canada, nous avons le même problème et nous sommes arrivés à une conclusion semblable. La vague d'innovation technique qui alimente les esprits plus brillants de cet État peut s'avérer être une force positive et transformatrice pour les Nord-Américains, mais nous ne pouvons pas permettre à cette vague de submerger les travailleurs et leurs familles. C'est quelque chose que nous pouvons et devons discuter dans le cadre de la modernisation et de l'amélioration de l'ALENA. Now, I've spoken a lot about trade and economics today, but my purpose here is not to speak about prosperity for its own sake or commerce for its own sake, as important as those discussions are. That's not how Ronald Reagan thought about these questions, and it's not how I think about them either. A human being is not a mere unit of economic production, nor can an international friendship and alliance, the greatest since the world has ever seen, be reduced to a balance of trade statistics or a tariff rate. President Reagan was, to his core, an optimist. He was unfailingly ambitious and courageous in his optimism. And as something of an optimist myself, I've always admired that. I think that it is especially germane to the dialogue we are having right now. Because optimism, ambition, and courage are not separate qualities. Where one is, you're likely to find the other too. The FTA and NAFTA were products of all three, of course. But it's not as though trade is the only great thing Canadians and Americans have accomplished together. Our countries fought and won the First World War side by side. We defeated the fascists in the Second World War side by side. And many of our brave boys are buried side by side in battlefields around the world. From the Halifax explosion of 1917, when Americans rushed to our aid in the initial emergency response, through 2 world wars, to the Korean War, the Afghan War, and more recently in retaking Mosul in northern Iraq, we have stood shoulder to shoulder through thick and thin. Canadian firefighters helped fight wildfires in California, just as American firefighters were there for us in Fort McMurray and British Columbia wildfires. And the drive towards North American free trade, historically, has always been as much about cementing that historic bond as it has been about the mechanics of tariffs or trade. It first gathered momentum under President Truman, just after the Second World War, as Canadians and Americans led the way in building the rules-based international order that set the stage for 70 years of global prosperity and stability. In speaking to a joint session of our Parliament in 1947, Truman argued that trade would be a critical tool in helping the nations of the world rebuild after the devastation of war. But he went further than that. He drew a direct line between free and fair trade, prosperity, and peace. And he held up Canada and the United States as a model to the world in this regard. We seek a peaceful world, Truman said, a prosperous world, a free world, a world of good neighbors, living on terms of equality and mutual respect, as Canada and the United States have lived for generations. I know every American president since then has echoed this idea. But it was, of course, President Reagan, 40 years later, who picked up that torch and carried it further than any president had before him. It was also in Ottawa, in a speech to a joint session of Canada's Parliament, that Reagan most resoundingly explained why. The date was April 6, 1987. The occasion was to launch the final big push towards the first Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. I think many in this room may recall what he said. We look forward to the day when the free flow of trade from the southern reaches of Tierra del Fuego to the northern outposts of the Arctic Circle unites the people of the Western Hemisphere in a bond of mutually beneficial exchange. When all borders become what the US-Canada border so long has been, a meeting place rather than a dividing line. A meeting place rather than a dividing line. Such optimism, such ambition, such courage. Truman and Reagan each presided over a historic American victory over tyranny, one in the Second World War, the other the Cold War, and both understood implicitly that free and fair trade is a pathway not just to prosperity, but to stability, liberty, and peace. We must remember this lesson. It is imperative that we remember. In closing, I'd just like to say this. We can and should do more to help the people who've been left behind by global trade. We can and must build bridges to new opportunities for the middle class and people working hard to join the middle class. We can and must work tirelessly to find a pathway to prosperity for us all. This is among the greatest challenges of our time. But in furthering these aims, let us not step back from the progress our countries have made with extraordinary effort since the post-war years. Let's not raise fresh barriers between our peoples. That would harm the very folks who need our help most. The nexus point for this all is NAFTA. The generation of Canadian, American, and Mexican leaders who bequeathed to us the original treaty, in a very real sense, invented the idea of North America. Uninventing it would come at a cost beyond the economic. And I don't think anyone can now entirely predict or understand. Our task, surely, is to take what our parents' generation built and transform it into a trade agreement fit for the 21st century. And to approach this as President Reagan would have, with optimism, ambition, and courage. And I'd add, with tenacity and focus. We need those too. We in Canada, for our part, will devote every necessary effort for as long as it takes, in a spirit of fairness and mutual compromise, to achieve this goal. Plato held that the greatest form of love is friendship, because friendship is born of affection and respect without obligation. And the remarkable thing about national friendships is that they can outlast the span of a single human life. Our national friendship now extends back 200 years. It will extend into the future for another 200 years, and the same again after that, I am certain. But we must do our part to make it so. President Reagan most famously declared, "It's morning in America." A generation later, it can be morning in North America. But that is up to us. My friends, let us keep to the task. Let us keep applying ourselves with unswerving dedication, with fierce ambition, relentless optimism, and unfailing courage. Let us get this good work done and hold aloft our partnership, like President Reagan did, as a beacon of liberty and an example to the world. Merci beaucoup, mes amis.